Okay, it's 2 minutes past the hour. I think we can go ahead and get started. First off, my name is Jesse Daystar. I'm the Chief Sustainability Officer here at Cotton Incorporated. And I really appreciate you joining us for this webinar where we'll talk about microfibers, both some past research as well as some recent research with Dr. Richard Venditti in North Carolina State, describing what happens when cellulose microfibers get into the environment. And this webinar is put on by Cottonworks today. Next slide. Cottonworks is a great tool for the supply chain where you can learn about these webinars, other sustainability topics, and how to use cotton in your product. So check out cottonworks.com for the recording later after this is done, as well as many other resources. Next slide. So in today's webinar, I'll sort of be moderating both the Q&A as well as starting us off here. But there will be a Q&A aspect. You'll see that down in the link below. There's a feature for that. As you enter your questions throughout the presentation, we really encourage you to do so. It'll make for a really nice conversation after we conclude the planned slides. I'll be moderating those questions to our presenters today. Also, this will be recorded, and that recording will live on cottonworks.com and should be up there in a few days or later this week. So I encourage you to check that out and share it with your colleagues and other folks that you think might need to see this. Next slide. So today we're really pleased to have two great speakers. Stephen Peers, our very own Associate Director of Sustainability at Cotton Incorporated, will kick us off describing some of our recent research and put some good context to this topic. Then we have esteemed Professor Dr. Richard Venditti of North Carolina State University in the Forest Biomaterials Department. And he'll come and present some of the most recent research we have on cotton and cellulose biodegradation. So with that, thanks again for coming to today's webinar, and I'll pass it over to Stephen.
Thanks a lot, Jesse. It's a pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure to be on this webinar and present this material to you today. We're going to start with level setting on some definitions to get everyone on the same page about what biodegradability is. We'll touch on some of the Earth's natural cycles where this process takes place. And then, not to scare you too much, we'll get into a little bit of organic chemistry, talk about cellulose, what it is, what it means, why it's important, touch on some of our past research and where we got to today with the research with Dr. Richard Venditti, which is really exciting. So with that, we will dive right into the definition. So most of us have probably heard of ISO, the International Standards Organization. So I pulled these from their website, their list of approved definitions. And again, just to get everyone on the same page, we're going to talk about biodegradability, biodegradation a lot on this call, this webinar. So what is it? Well, simply put, it's degradation caused by biological activity. So that's organisms in the environment that will use typically enzymatic action to break down a compound. This is going to result in significant chemical structure change of that material. Biodegradability simply is just how susceptible an organic substance is to that biodegradation. And organic here means, from, again, your organic chemistry days back in college, just anything with a carbon-hydrogen bond. So classic definition, carbon-containing compound, essentially. So how susceptible is an organism to material to that process? Zoom way out here, so we have the Earth. Of course, this is a complex system. I like to say it's full of circular processes, and we'll touch on this in a little bit. But you see the clouds and the green, which is the plant material. The concept of biodegradability is just linked into one of these inherently circular processes that we have on Earth, and cotton and other biomaterials definitely get to play into this cyclical nature of Earth. Talked about cellulose a lot too, so I just want to level set on what that is. Cellulose is thought to be the most abundant naturally occurring polymer on Earth, and it's found in the primary constituent of plant cell walls. Essentially, it's just repeating chains of glucose. This could be anywhere from 100 or 1,000 to 30,000 chains long, so it has a really high degree of polymerization. You see here, again, the organic chemistry take place. So that's a glucose compound, so they're linked together in really long chains. and they're found in plant material all over the world. So I have circled here the Amazon rainforest in South America. So it's a really significant source of cellulose. It's thought that the earth actually naturally cycles 15 trillion tons of cellulose per year. So we produce and decompose this naturally on earth. Cotton is a plant, of course. The lint in cotton fiber is 95% cellulose. The remainder is some degree of ash and other materials, and important sources of cellulose globally. So of course we have cotton. We talked about the Amazon rainforest, so forest, other forests across the globe, and then other agricultural landscapes too. So all these collectively, make up this massive amount of cellulose that's naturally cycled by our earth every single year. And, this cyclical nature of carbon and cotton fits into this center piece here. So that's part of the carbon cycle. The carbon in that cellulose naturally is pulled from the atmosphere through the process of photosynthesis. And as those plants decay, they re-release that CO2 back in the atmosphere. So that's that cyclical nature, that 15 trillion metric tons we were estimating from that publication that Earth naturally cycles every year. And then, of course, we have other naturally cyclical processes like the nitrogen cycle and the water cycle and many, many more. But just to point out that we're lucky to be a plant in this world because we have these naturally cyclical processes that we get to benefit from. Here's just a graphic from NASA sort of showing this Earth as a living system and some other cyclical nature of the freezing and thawing of the Earth and temperature changes and precipitation. So it's really fascinating system. And we're, again, benefiting from being on this biosphere as a cotton plant. So you may have seen this before. This is called the butterfly diagram from Ellen MacArthur. It's sort of a way that people think about the concept of circularity. And for cotton and other renewable materials, other biomaterials, they actually sit on this left side, which is known as the biosphere. So those are considered renewable materials. So again, luckily, we're part of this as cotton. And if we do different things, different regenerative ag practices, compost cotton, perhaps, you can actually regenerate the biosphere. So we also have the unique ability to do that where this right side of the equation, the technosphere, so these are things that are finite, so non-renewable resources, they really don't have any possibility of regenerating the earth. So we need to do our best to keep these in circulation as long as possible. I personally believe that that's why this focus on circularity, recyclability, all of these things came into play so much. Another point is because both of these systems, we need to minimize systematic leakage and any negative externalities. So both systems kind of have this same thing in mind, same goal, if you will, on how to be circular by nature. Now, this is probably not news to anyone at this point, but we all know that we wash a load of laundry, that abrasive nature of those clothes, bouncing around in the washing machine releases thousands of microfibers. But some of the research will show is that the cotton microfibers, being cellulosic materials, they actively biodegrade in a variety of aquatic environments, specifically sewage treatment plants, wastewater treatment plants. And some of those synthetic microfibers actually do not biodegrade. They're not designed to break down, and they might make their way into the world. And we've seen this with research. So this is a not-for-profit organization called Adventure Scientists. They compile different data from around the world, from average citizens to academic publications, and essentially everywhere we look in the aquatic environment, we find these microplastics. We've even found them in the Arctic and in the deserts of Central Asia and Iran. So they're all over the place, and it's quite concerning. Also, the average person is becoming more concerned about this. We do this study frequently at Cotton Incorporated. Most recently, our consumer insights team through Lifestyle Monitor did some research showing 40% of consumers are aware of this term of microplastic pollution. And then they're bothered, 62% of which are bothered by brands that use these materials due to this microplastic pollution concept. And I think the most important number here is that 65% of those people are actually going to change their purchase decision. So this problem and concept is really causing people to change the way they spend their money. in terms of apparel. Very important. Now we're going to talk about the timeline, some of the research we've done. Actually, all of this research has been in collaboration with NC State University. And you'll hear from one of the leading researchers here in a little bit, Dr. Richard Venditti. First paper we did back in 2019 was focused on microfiber shedding and biodegradability. So we looked at the biodegradability of microfibers coming from laundry effluent in wastewater treatment inoculum. And showed that cotton biodegraded. We'll highlight some of this research. Then we expanded the shedding, refined the results, and actually subjected those materials to more aquatic environments. So we added not only wastewater treatment inoculum, but we added aquatic environments such as lake water and seawater as well. Naturally, the next question was, well, what about dyes and finishes? So we looked at cotton microfibers that were treated with different types of dyes and finishes and actually compared them to an oak leaf, which I'll show here in a second. The really exciting research that we have that Dr. Venditti is going to cover is this microfiber biodegradability compared to commonly flushed materials such as tissue paper and other types of wipes. I'll let Dr. Venditti cover that in detail. So this is this 2020 research that essentially showed that cotton microfibers degraded significantly in all environments where polyester did not. So you see these charts is actually a screenshot from the publication itself. And cotton is this sort of purplish line here. It's basically at the top of all these. So if you were 100%, you'd be fully biodegraded within that time frame tested. You see cotton is at the top of the chart almost every time. This yellow line here actually is microcrystalline cellulose, which I might get Venditti to talk about later, but essentially that's the maximum theoretical achievable biodegradability in a particular system. And again, the research here showed that cotton microfibers biodegraded in all of these environments, and polyester is this line here down at the bottom, which is pretty much not degrading at all in each one of those. So we took that one step further because, like I said, the next question we got was, well, what happens with dyed and finished microfibers in cotton? And we actually compared those to another commonly occurring plant material in the environment, an oak leaf. So this X here on that line is actually the oak leaf compared to cotton with a variety of finishes. And while the finishes perhaps slowed the degradability in some cases early on, overall they degraded dramatically and even faster than an oak leaf. So, I'm not hearing anybody say we have an oak leaf problem. And again, this is just back to that point I made earlier, how the world is naturally cycling these cellulosic compounds every single day due to the fact that they're, just plant material existing on the earth. So cotton is also part of that cycle. All right, so this is my last slide before I pass it to Dr. Venditti. I just want to sort of frame up his research. And you're probably wondering why there's a 4-pack toilet paper on the screen. Well, it turns out the average person consumes about 45 pounds of toilet paper a year, and toilet paper is actually comprised of cellulosic microfibers that come from trees. So cotton cellulosic microfibers come from the lint itself, the nice white fluffy cotton ball that you see in my background. And so we use about 45 pounds of toilet tissue a year. And if you equate that to some of the numbers we published from our previous work with NC State, you'd have to wash 1.4 million t-shirts to equate to that same mass of tissue paper that one person used in a year. And if you look at this graphic, it's kind of hard to see, but here's the toilet. So, of course, we flush toilet paper down the drain. And then anytime you do a load of laundry, that discharge from that laundry machine also goes to that same line, your wastewater treatment pipes underneath the ground that go to the wastewater treatment plant. So these go to the same place. And we are going to show with Dr. Venditti's work that both of these materials dramatically biodegrade. Actually, cotton microfibers degrade similarly to toilet tissue, if not faster. So hopefully I didn't steal all your thunder, Dr. Venditti, but with that, I'm going to let you take it over.
Okay, thank you, Stephen. It's my pleasure to talk to you all today about a recent research project that we did in our labs at NC State. The research was headed by was actually executed by Dr. Madeline Smith and collaborators, including Dr. Joel Pollack and some other researchers at NC State in collaboration with Cotton Incorporated. And really what we were trying to do was to evaluate in general how different types of cotton and cellulosic materials, when they're flushed, how they behave in the environment or in wastewater treatment plants, and how they might biodegrade in nature. All right, so the basic objective is here to look at commonly flushed materials, things that would be disposed of in our drains, and try to understand, their fate in a wastewater treatment plant or other environmental places like fresh or seawater. The materials we tested were things that, three of the things that we would expect to be in drains and sewers. The first one on the left here is microfibers that would be generated during washing of clothes. And so we looked at cotton microfibers because our previous research showed that polyester fibers didn't biodegrade, but the cotton microfibers did. And this is actually going to be a control to compare to other commonly flushed materials. Then we also looked at flushable wipes. These were a commercial product, and they're basically all cellulose. So the cellulose in these wipes is very, very similar to the cotton microfiber cellulose or cellulose that's in a shirt. Those celluloses had natural fibers that may be wood fibers or cotton fibers, and then they also had regenerated celluloses that were dissolved and then spun into fibers and put into the product. The toilet paper, most people are very familiar with that and appreciative. The toilet paper was also a commercial product, and the toilet paper, it's mainly almost 100% cellulose, but there are some finishing chemicals, we use to manufacture the paper to make it soft and to give it some strength properties too. But for the most part, it's greater than 99% wood fiber and cellulose. And then as another control, we looked at a polypropylene-based wipe. So this was a commercial product, and it basically has a lot of wet strength because it's polypropylene. It's a plastic that doesn't lose its strength when it's immersed in water. So that product had about 28% cellulose. That's usually used to absorb materials in the wipe, for the wipe, and then it has the polypropylene. So it's a composite of polypropylene and cellulose. Another reason we looked at that was because drainage blocks are a really important problem in the world. I think that there was a statistic that said in the United Kingdom alone, there are over 300,000 sewer blocks from pluggage per year. And that's got a lot of financial, technical, and even health implications that are important. So if we take a look at our materials, it's very important to kind of look at them at a microscopic level. And on the left, you'll see the cotton microfibers, and we generated these in our lab. So these are actual textile microfibers that have been cut to a length of about 1 millimeter and are very, very representative of microfibers you'd get from laundering. The second one is flushable wipes, and those flushable wipes are going to have two different types of cellulose. One of the cellulose is from wood fibers, and you can see that that red arrow is pointing to a wood fiber, natural. You can see there's a texture and a grain to that. And then there's also regenerated cellulose, the cellulose that's been dissolved and then spun into fibers. And that allows us to get long fibers that are useful for things like flushable wipes. Now, with those wipes, they will disperse in water once flushed, and then they're all cotton, so the expectation is that they're biodegradable. The third images are the polypropylene-based wipe, and here in the image you can see that we're pointing to a natural cellulose-based fiber and then a synthetic polypropylene-based fiber. You can see that they are connected, but each one of those is exposed to an aqueous environment that they could be in. And then finally on the right is the tissue paper, the toilet paper, and you can see there that it's all natural wood-based fibers, and that's all cellulose in the same vein that the cotton and the flushable wipes are cellulose. Another important thing to note on this figure is that although the sizes of the samples that we tested the microfibers, those were in a fluff form, dispersed form. The wipes and the tissue paper, we cut them into about a 1 centimeter square, and we used those as our samples that we looked at for biodegradation. Okay, so when we do biodegradation, what we try to do in the lab is we try to simulate what's actually happening in the environment. And so what we will do is we'll have a reactor, and we will put in our material that we're going to investigate for biodegradation. And then the idea is that we're going to put in microorganisms from the environment that can act and process the organic materials. We used 3 different sources of these microorganisms. The first one came from the wastewater treatment plant here locally in the Raleigh area. And we took biosolids from that. And those are very rich in the microorganisms that are used to process biosolids in a wastewater treatment plant. So they're specially cultured in order to do exactly what we want, and that is to biodegrade cellulose. And then we looked at some other environments like ocean water and lake water. And these have naturally occurring organisms, and they're not as enriched as in the wastewater treatment plant, but those are the organisms that if any material actually makes its way to a lake or the sea, they would actively work to biodegrade your material. We took very great care in the sampling and mixing. For instance, the seawater, we mixed high tide water and low tide water, and we took care of these inoculums and added actually nutrients in order so that the microorganisms that are present there would work. On the right is our measuring device. So what we do is we have reactors, we put in our substrate that's like the tissue paper and the cotton microfibers. And then we put in our microorganisms, we put in our nutrients, we keep the temperature constant, and we make sure that there's a lot of oxygen in there because we're looking at aerobic digestion. And what happens is the microorganisms, they basically process the organic material with the use of the oxygen, and they emit carbon dioxide. And actually, what we're doing in these tests is we're measuring the extra carbon dioxide from the biodegradation in order to determine how much of the carbon in the cellulose has been biodegraded. This kind of shows you some of the output that we get in our chamber. Basically, we've got several different reactors going on at the same time. We can measure oxygen, carbon dioxide, and methane. Methane is not a desired species here. If we did have significant methane, it would mean that we didn't have enough oxygen. But we look at mainly the oxygen and the carbon dioxide. In the environment, we have about 420 parts per million of carbon dioxide. So a lot of the numbers that we're reporting here are above 420 parts per million. That amount of carbon dioxide above the amount that's natural in the environment, that is indicative of biodegradation of our materials. And so we track that on a regular basis through our equipment. And we have controls, blanks and controls that we compare to, and we subtract the blank value off to get actually the CO2 that's emitted by the biodegradation of our substrates. Okay, So as I mentioned, we're very careful in putting in a certain amount of suspended solids for our wastewater treatment plant. That will give us an idea of how much microorganisms are in our system. In the seawater, we just take the samples and we add nutrients to them, and same thing with the lake water. And we determine biodegradation with the equation at the bottom here. The carbon dioxide production we monitor and we measure, and then we divide that by the theoretical carbon dioxide if 100% of the carbon was biodegraded. So we do elemental analysis on our samples. We find out how much carbon, we translate that into theoretical carbon dioxide, and we actually use the emitted carbon dioxide beyond and above the blanks to determine the amount of carbon that's biodegraded. So let's get to some of the results now. Here we have several of our samples plotted versus days. What you'll see is we had about a little bit over 100 days to do these experiments, and the y-axis gives us the biodegradation extent. Typically, we look at the MCC, that's microcrystalline cellulose. So that's a cellulose that's been highly processed. This microcrystalline cellulose was about 20 microns in radius. So they're particles, and that size is about the same size as, like, let's say the cotton diameter or wood fiber diameter or things like that. So that's a very good indication of whether we have microorganisms that are actively working to process organic material. And you can see here that the MCC in about 100 days degraded about 60% or so. And if you compare that with some of the other materials that we looked at, let's look at the cotton microfibers. The cotton microfibers in purple, they degraded the most and the most rapidly. And so what we can see here is that the cellulose there and the microfibers degraded quickly, and that's because cotton is cellulose and cellulose is biodegradable. And the microfibers had a lot of area, surface area, for the microorganisms to act and secrete enzymes on in order to process that material. If you compare that with the tissue paper, similar extents of biodegradation after about 100 days, and that would be to be expected. The tissue paper is, of course, predominantly cotton and cellulose. Is predominantly cellulose, not cotton, excuse me, wood fibers. And it has some light chemical treatment, which may have slowed down the biodegradation, but hasn't impeded it ultimately. The flushable wipes, they have natural cellulosic-based fibers, and they also have regenerated cellulose. And we see that both of those can biodegrade in a rapid manner, quickly and fully extensively within the reaction process. Now let's compare that to the polypropylene-based wipes, which we see only have a very moderate amount of biodegradation. If you'll recall, the polypropylene-based wipes are a composite. They have polypropylene and cellulose. The cellulose is about 28%. And you can see over the time span of this experiment, we've gotten maybe 17 or so percent biodegradation, which corresponds to the cellulosic component of the wipe. So the polypropylene is not biodegrading and the cellulose is. And I'll show you some images later that and some analytical work that we've done to show that. Here we are in the seawater. So this came off the North Carolina coast. And what you see are the results for all of the cellulosic materials. They're all biodegrading around 75 to 80% or so within the area of our experiments. And so you can see cellulose within any different ones of these products is biodegrading in a relatively extensive way at the same time. For this experiment, we only ran it for about 40 days. And so you can see that the biodegradation is actually pretty rapid. For the polypropylene-based wipes, again, we're getting about 18 or so percent biodegradation, which corresponds to a majority of that 28% of the cellulose that's in there. But the good news is that even in ocean water with the saline and the salt there, we're seeing extensive cellulose biodegradation as we'd expect. In lake water, very similar results. Over a 50-day period, we see that most the cellulosic materials are biodegrading. There's a little bit of a change in order there, but again, these experiments are variable because we're using a living population of microorganisms. Just imagine, trying to get like the whole city of Raleigh or another city to all eat the same food and be the same weight. There's a natural variability of organisms, and so there is some variability here. If you look at the polypropylene-based wipes, we saw something unusual and unexpected in that we didn't see any essential biodegradation in these experiments. However, when we looked at some other analysis of those polypropylene-based wipes, we saw a very extensive biodegradation of the cellulose. So we feel like that curve might be an outlier. Yeah, we did some material characterization in order to understand in that composite that has polypropylene and cellulosic material what was biodegrading. And here you see some images with a scanning electron microscope. On the left, we have this is the polypropylene-based wipe before biodegradation, and on the right, we have it after biodegradation. And what you can see here pretty easily are these polypropylene filaments, and then this right here is a melt-bonded area of polypropylene. So that could even encompass some of the cellulose. And then you can also see here that there's cellulosic fibers. In the top left, it's this white kind of wavy thing that has this spiral to it. Down here below, you can see the polypropylene is a very smooth synthetic plastic. And here's the cellulose down at the bottom here. It has pits and natural defects from the, just natural plant-based cellulose. So that's before. Now, after, what we see is we only see indications of the polypropylene. So if you look here at this close-up down here, what you'll see is only polypropylene filaments, and you will not see any of the natural fibers that are made from cellulose in this picture at all. In fact, you can kind of see here, there's a little impression where maybe a cellulose fiber was pressed in and then is now gone. You can see tiny, tiny remnants of something that looks like it's stuck to the polypropylene. We suspect that's cotton. However, we were able to do some analytical work, and through thermogravimetric analysis, we were able to confirm that there was no cellulose in these. There was very, very little to no cellulose after biodegradation in even the polypropylene wipe. Okay, so to summarize, what we found was that cellulose biodegrades very rapidly, no matter what the form is. So toilet paper that's supposed to be flushed, microfibers from cotton fabrics that end up in our wastewaters, and then even the cellulosics in wipes, they all biodegrade. And we found that they extensively biodegrade in wastewater treatment plant environments and also in ocean water and in freshwater like lakes. For the composites, for the polypropylene cellulose, polypropylene-based wipe, we found that, the amount of cellulose in there was biodegrading, and it was mostly uninfluenced by the presence of the polypropylene. So if that cellulose is exposed to the water phase and the microorganisms, it will biodegrade even in a composite. We did find that most of the cellulosics, they all biodegraded almost about at the same extent. And so really the size of the initial material, whether it's in a wipe or a tissue or even microfibers, that had some effects to the results, but wasn't really a dominant effect on the biodegradation. So any size will biodegrade. Another thing we found was that, the rate of biodegradation was very high for the cellulosic materials, and very quick. In the polypropylene-based wipe, which had the lowest percent biodegradation due to the low cellulosic content, what we saw was that the cellulose degraded basically independently of the polypropylene portion. And we also noticed that the polypropylene did not biodegrade at all. So there's a lot of more research that we need to do. So that's, analyzing the biodegradation of cellulosic materials more on a molecular level, trying to understand crystallinity, molecular weight, as slight differences in the cellulose and cellulose that may have an impact on those rates. And then we also want to look at other factors other than the composition that might affect biodegradation. And that includes surface area, fiber nature, fiber roughness, and crystallinity. And like I said before, we do believe that cellulose is biodegradable, and that's whether it's in a composite with a plastic or if it's been lightly treated with a chemical like in a fabric or as is tissue paper that we use. And that, I think, concludes my presentation. Love to answer any questions that anybody might have.
Great. Thank you very much, Dr. Venditti and Stephen. That's a great presentation all around, covering many great topics. And we do have a few questions coming in, but definitely everybody online, please submit your questions down in the Q&A area. All right, to kick this off, got one for Dr. Venditti. One of the first ones here is, how similar is the cotton cellulose to the paper cellulose in general? And are there chemistries, I think you kind of mentioned it, are there chemistries applied to paper?
Yeah, so the cellulose composition in cotton and wood fibers is very, very similar. So they actually have the same atoms and the same molecules that are connected into a polymer. Cotton might have a slightly higher crystallinity and perhaps maybe a longer molecular weight, but in general, they're almost the same. And I would say that the second part of that question was about chemicals applied. The chemicals applied to fabric finishes like softeners, wrinkle resistance, those are similar in some sense to some paper making chemicals that we add to provide water resistance, dimensional stability during when it picks up moisture and things like that. So, and they're applied at a very low level, mainly just a surface coating in order to improve properties of both products.
Great, thank you very much. Stephen, this one's for you. We keep hearing about there are folks and researchers or various papers citing the appearance of cellulose microfibers in the ocean. Some claim that these are even cotton microfibers. What do you think's going on here, and why that we're seeing claims such as this?
Yeah, I think I've seen some of those similar studies, and I've thought about this quite a bit. And aside from the fact that we saw that graphic I showed with 15 trillion tons of naturally produced cellulose that our Earth cycles every single year. So there's, that much material that's out there, plant material everywhere. You look out your window, you see it, you look in my background, there's cotton plants, but it's all cellulose. And, it's quite difficult to identify, through these different methods. And I think, up front, we showed some images of that. Dr. Venditti did scanning electron microscopy. So you could tell, whether it's cellulose or not, but the source of the cellulose is very difficult to say that's from cotton or that's from, a tree or naturally occurring cellulose. I think as it weathers through time, also the process gets a little bit more complicated too. So I just think that's probably the main issue. It's just really hard to differentiate between that naturally occurring cellulose, that massive amount that Earth produces and consumes every single year. I'd say that's probably the main reason. And then, depending on the environment, you do have, we showed with the research Dr. Venditti presented here that, wastewater treatment, seawater, lake water, they all biodegraded, but the rates were slightly different. So the environment it ends up in does have an influence on it, but at the end of the day, we know these naturally occurring materials do biodegrade.
Great. That actually leads me kind of into this next question. Dr. Venditti, what do you think really drives the biodegradation of cellulose? Is it the surface area or biological activity that's most important, or maybe another parameter?
Okay. Well, the biodegradation of cellulose, we know is mainly driven. Cellulose, we know, is just like Stephen said, it's processed, biodegraded at the millions and millions of tons per year. And so really what's really important is the environment. We need to have active microorganisms that can process this cellulose. Without those microorganisms, nothing will biodegrade. So, when we disinfect something and then we put it in a Ziploc bag and we freeze it, it's not going to biodegrade. There's just no microorganisms there, and the conditions aren't there. So the microorganisms are the main driver, the concentration, and then their environment. They have to have nutrients. They have to have the correct pH and temperature. They need to have moisture. All these things make those microorganisms active, and they can readily process the cotton and the cellulose. Size is a secondary effect, in my opinion, and specific surface area is a secondary effect. The size and the surface area, the higher the surface area, the faster these processes will occur. But certainly, the microorganism viability around the cellulose is the major thing.
That's great. That's great. Another really good question. Sort of change words just a little bit, but are there like accredited tests that one could perform to prove biodegradability, or maybe are there standards that one could use to measure biodegradability? Dr. Venditti, I believe you use several of these standards. Is that correct? Maybe you could talk about those a little bit.
Yeah, so we have different standards. They're published by ISO and ASTM. So these are standard testing groups of scientists that have come around certain processes, and we use those in our labs. They will dictate the blank to use, the control to use, the environment to use. And then there's many different types of biodegradation tests. So there's one for home composting. There's one for industrial composting that might have a higher temperature. And then we have different testing methods for different aqueous environments. And that's what I showed today: seawater, lake water, wastewater treatment types of water. And then, so those are also important. And what people need to appreciate is that there's an infinite amount of environments out there, and some of them have a lot of oxygen and water and microorganisms, and some don't. And so all these different testing methods are defined in order to kind of reflect some part of the environment, but they can't. Not one individual test can encompass every environment.
That's really good. Thank you. Building on that a little bit, we have a question about how the conditions that these fibers exist in, for example, in a river or in a lake or wastewater treatment, agitation, aeration, those types of mechanical or fluid dynamics, would that increase the biodegradation potentially? And also, was that simulated or reproduced in your experiments?
Yeah, so you're right. The amount of mixing and turbulence and liquid motion is going to have an impact on the biodegradation. Biodegradation is very interesting. You have a microorganism, and that secretes enzymes. The enzymes can actually make the cellulose smaller molecules. Those molecules diffuse back into the microorganism, and then the microorganism processes that into energy and emits carbon dioxide. All those sub processes that I mentioned depend on diffusion and fluid flow and the amount of dissolved oxygen in the system and the nutrients that have to accompany this biodegradation process. So those are all very important. In the lab, we try to control those as carefully as possible. We typically, the key things are, we need to have the nutrients in there. And then we also have very strict stirring processes to keep everything well mixed. We make sure that we're doing aerobic biodegradation. That means oxygen is present. So we're always making sure we have excess oxygen in there, and we keep the temperature correct. And then, yeah, we just make that environment as friendly as possible for those microorganisms to be viable.
That's great. Here, I have two questions that kind of ask similar things here. It's one is sort of like, why does the biodegradation kind of plateau, around 70 to 80 or so percent for all the microcrystalline and other materials? And then will the cellulose potentially biodegrade entirely over time? And if so, any idea what that might look like?
Yeah, so I mean, ideally, we know that cellulose should go to 100%, and we could force it to go to 100% in our lab by overdosing with more nutrients, more organisms, and things like that. And so what we find out is we've got a reactor. It's a closed chamber. We put the microorganisms in there. They somehow adapt to their environment. They process much of the cellulose as much as they can. And then somehow they become fat and happy, in a very non-scientific term, and it plateaus off. What would happen in the real environment if we were in a lake or in a river? You've got constant microorganisms coming and microorganisms going. You have nutrients coming and going. There's always oxygenation. So it's a very different process. I think some of the plateaus we're seeing are the fact that we're trying to model in the environment, but we're using a batch process, and it's not a perfect match to the wild environment that's out there.
Certainly. That's a great answer. Here's one for Stephen. We've mostly focused on biodegradation in natural environments. I think the world, maybe does realize that, there's other environments that are designed for biodegradation. Maybe you could touch on, composting. What is that in essence, and how does that compare to, say, lake water or these environments we've talked about so far? Stephen, could you handle that?
Right, for sure. So, in the end, both of these systems are, biodegrading in a similar fashion. Dr. Mudity was talking about the microorganisms that exist, and those are really critical to break down the material, regardless of what environments it's in. So for compost conditions, the main difference there is that it's a very controlled environment in a soil type situation. So I suppose that's the main difference, but you actually control specifically a variety of factors. So here, moisture content is very important. It's also anaerobic biodegradability situation. So you're either turning the soil to stimulate that air flow in the pile, typically either a static aerated pile or a windrow, or some of the common forms of composting. Then you have what's known as a compost recipe. So you're dialing in this carbon to nitrogen ratio, which is very important to stimulate that biodegradation and that the biological activity to break that down. So in the case of cotton in a composting environment, you have that carbon to nitrogen ratio. Typically, you'd have different types of food waste that would provide your nitrogen source, and then perhaps say like leaf matter and other yard waste that could provide your carbon source. In this situation, if we were to put cotton in the environment, in this composting environment, that would replace some of the carbon. So you'd have to change the recipe. And we've actually done this in some studies with Cornell University, looked at this, and cotton denim compost very well. We actually tested it as well with some cotton jersey fabrics that had softeners and that sort of thing on them, and they composted very well as well. So if you get the environment right, and this composting is very specific, you need to monitor, the temperature, the moisture content, all of these different things are also important. Similarly to an aquatic environment, if you get that environment correct, it will biodegrade in that environment as well. Again, it's cellulose, so those materials are naturally occurring in the compost waste stream now, in the form of yard waste. That's the most common cellulose source, carbon source also in that current compost environment.
That's great. Well, we really covered a lot of bases here in a lot of environments, and yeah, I think our body of research, we've looked at it from many different ways and different conditions, different environments, different chemistries, different we've tried to test and to further explore how cotton biodegrades and understand where other materials do not. And it's interesting when we look at scientific bodies of evidence. Usually, if you see something that begins, if more studies come out that further support the point, it grows through time, the strength of the statement that cellulose biodegrades in the natural environments and cotton biodegrades in natural environments. So we consistently continue to see this, and I'm sure more work will come out on this. And Dr. Menditti, probably more from your lab and others around the world. And we definitely look forward to, reading that, viewing that, maybe more webinars. And Stephen, I imagine down the road we might do, I think we have done a webinar on composting. So I think that can be checked out at cottonworks.com. And I know we have some ongoing projects there, very exciting around composting and just circularity of cotton in general, because I think as you've seen from this total webinar that cotton comes from nature, it's grown and takes CO2 out of the air. We use it in our garments. We enjoy that material, that cotton, and then ultimately it can go back to the environment in the way in which it came from the environment, and that's through biodegradation. And it's a circular cycle of carbon that we have here in the world and in our clothing. So with that, I think that's a great place to stop. We really do appreciate everybody coming to this webinar today and the excellent questions you provided. Again, check out cottonworks.com for the recording. And with that, I'll say goodbye. Thank you.
Thank you.